A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin as the senior flight attendant pointed a manicured finger toward the economy section. "Your tickets flagged a system error, ma'am. You need to move to the back," she sneered, her voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt. Sarah clutched her 7-year-old son, his small hands trembling against her coat. She had paid for these seats, but in the eyes of this crew member, her skin color made her boarding pass irrelevant. What happened next would ground the flight and end a career. The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Chicago O'Hare's International Terminal matched the chaotic, anxious energy vibrating through the crowded gate area. It was a miserable Tuesday evening in late November, and Flight 482 to London Heathrow had already been delayed by 2 agonizing hours. Passengers were slumped in uncomfortable vinyl chairs, aggressively typing on laptops, or pacing the patterned grey carpets with phones pressed tight to their ears. In the corner, away from the worst of the congestion, sat 34-year-old Sarah Jenkins. She was an architect by trade, a woman who spent her days designing stable, beautiful structures, but right now her entire world felt dangerously close to collapsing. Beside her, huddled under an oversized wool sweater, was her 7-year-old son, Leo. Leo was not like other boys his age. He had been born with a severe, chronic pulmonary condition that made his lungs incredibly fragile. A common cold could send him to the emergency room. A sudden drop in air pressure or a stressful environment could trigger an asthma attack so violent it required immediate medical intervention. For the past 3 years, Sarah had worked grueling 70-hour weeks, taking on every freelance drafting gig she could find, quietly siphoning every spare dollar into a dedicated savings account. She had skipped lunches, cancelled subscriptions, and sold her car, all to afford this specific trip. They were flying to London to consult with Dr. William Hastings, a world-renowned pediatric pulmonologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital, who had pioneered a new treatment that could finally give Leo a normal life. Because of Leo's delicate health, flying economy was a genuine medical risk. The cramped spaces, the restricted airflow, and the inability to lie down during the 8-hour transatlantic flight could easily trigger a severe respiratory episode. So Sarah had done something she had never done in her life. She emptied her savings and purchased 2 lay-flat business first-class tickets. They cost more than her rent for an entire year, but looking at Leo's pale, exhausted face, she knew it was worth every single penny. "Mommy, my chest feels tight," Leo whispered, his voice barely rising above the dull roar of the terminal. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that always made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "I know, baby," Sarah said softly, pulling him closer and rubbing small circles on his back. "We're going to board soon. You're going to have a big, soft seat that turns into a bed, and you can sleep the whole way to London. I promise." At the boarding desk, the gate agents were frantically typing at their keyboards, trying to manage the backlog of frustrated passengers. Standing slightly apart from them, overseeing the process with a hawk-like intensity, was Beatrice Miller. Beatrice was the senior flight attendant, a woman in her late 50s with hair sprayed into an immovable blonde helmet and a uniform that looked as though it had been tailored and ironed to military standards. Even from 50 feet away, Sarah could sense an aura of rigid, uncompromising authority radiating from the woman. Beatrice watched the passengers with a look of permanent distaste, as if their mere presence was an insult to the aircraft she commanded. Finally, the crackle of the PA system cut through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay." We are now beginning the boarding process for Flight 482 to London Heathrow, starting with our first class and business class passengers, as well as those needing extra time or assistance. Relief washed over Sarah. She grabbed her heavy tote bag, which carefully housed Leo's nebulizer, his emergency inhalers, and a binder full of his medical records, and gently helped Leo to his feet. They walked toward the priority lane. There were only about a dozen other people in this line, mostly older businessmen in tailored suits and wealthy couples wearing expensive cashmere. Sarah, wearing comfortable black leggings and a plain cotton tunic, and Leo in his oversized sweater and soft sweatpants, undeniably stood out. As they approached the podium, Sarah extended her phone to scan their digital boarding passes. The machine let out a cheerful beep, and the screen flashed green. Seat 2A, Seat 2B. First class. Before Sarah could take a step toward the jet bridge, a manicured hand slammed down onto the scanner, blocking her path. It was Beatrice. The senior flight attendant looked Sarah up and down, her eyes lingering on Sarah's natural hair, her unbranded clothing, and finally, the exhausted little black boy clinging to her hand. Beatrice's lips thinned into a tight, skeptical line. "Excuse me," Beatrice said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This is the line for first and business class passengers only. The economy boarding zones will not be called for another 20 minutes. You need to step aside." Sarah blinked, momentarily thrown by the sheer hostility in the woman's voice. She forced a polite, accommodating smile. "Oh, we are in first class. The scanner just cleared us. Seats 2A and 2B. Beatrice didn't move her hand. She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. "Let me see your boarding passes, not the digital ones. Hand me your phone." Though irritated by the demand, Sarah unlocked her phone and handed it over. Beatrice swiped aggressively at the screen, scrutinizing the electronic tickets as if looking for a forgery. She checked the names, the flight numbers, and the seat assignments. When she couldn't find a flaw, she shoved the phone back at Sarah. "Did you purchase these tickets yourself, or were they an upgrade at the desk?" Beatrice asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "I purchased them directly through the airline's website," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden, hot prickle of indignation rising in her chest. Behind her, a businessman sighed loudly and checked his Rolex, clearly annoyed by the hold-up. Beatrice gave Sarah one last deeply skeptical look. It was a look Sarah had seen countless times in her life, in high-end boutiques, in upscale restaurants, and in bank loan offices. It was the look that wordlessly communicated, "You do not belong here, and I am going to figure out why." "Fine, go ahead," Beatrice finally snapped, gesturing toward the jet bridge as if waving away a nuisance. "But make sure you find your exact seats quickly. We are already behind schedule, and I will not have passengers wandering the aisles." "Thank you," Sarah said curtly. She gripped Leo's hand tighter and walked down the slanted, carpeted tunnel toward the aircraft. Her hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline of the unprovoked confrontation coursing through her veins. She told herself to let it go. They were on the plane. They had their seats. Nothing was going to ruin this trip for Leo. She had no idea that the nightmare was only just beginning. Stepping into the first-class cabin felt like entering a different world. The chaotic, fluorescent misery of the terminal was instantly replaced by soft, warm amber lighting, the faint smell of roasted nuts, and the quiet hum of the aircraft's climate control. The cabin was spacious, featuring massive cream-colored leather pods that offered total privacy and comfort. Sarah found seats 2A and 2B on the left side of the aircraft. She helped Leo into the window seat, 2A. The boy's eyes widened in sheer wonder. He ran his small hands over the supple leather, pressing the buttons on the armrest that controlled the seat's recline, his previous exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this new adventure. "Look, Mummy, it's like a spaceship," Leo whispered excitedly, a weak but genuine smile spreading across his face. "It sure is, sweetie," Sarah smiled, hoisting her large tote bag into the overhead bin above them, ensuring she placed it right at the front where she could easily grab it if Leo needed his medication. She sat down in 2B, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The stress of the past 48 hours seemed to melt away into the plush cushions. She buckled her seatbelt and closed her eyes, silently thanking God that they had made it. Across the aisle, in seat 2E, a woman named Evelyn Gable was settling in. Evelyn was a woman dripping in generational wealth. She wore a pristine white Chanel blazer, heavy diamond rings, and carried a tiny, shivering Pomeranian in a designer carrier. As Sarah and Leo got comfortable, Evelyn peered over the divider. Her gaze swept over Sarah, then locked onto Leo, who let out a small, rattling cough. Evelyn's nose wrinkled in profound disgust. She immediately flagged down a passing flight attendant. It was Beatrice, who had just come aboard from the gate to prepare the cabin for departure. Sarah didn't hear the entire conversation, but she caught snippets of Evelyn's harsh, entitled whispering. "Paid a premium. Absolute racket. Coughing all over. Don't belong here." Beatrice leaned in, nodding sympathetically at Evelyn. She patted the wealthy woman's shoulder, whispered something reassuring, and then turned. Her eyes locked onto Sarah. The predatory gleam had returned. Beatrice smoothed down her uniform skirt, adjusted her posture, and marched over to row 2. She stood over Sarah, blocking the aisle completely, her body language radiating confrontation. "Excuse me, ma'am," Beatrice said. The volume of her voice was completely unnecessary for the quiet cabin, clearly designed to draw the attention of the other first-class passengers. "I'm going to need to see your boarding passes again. And your identification." Sarah's stomach dropped. "I just showed them to you at the gate 3 minutes ago." "And I need to see them again," Beatrice demanded, holding out her hand expectantly. "Now, please, we have a manifest discrepancy." Trying to keep the peace, Sarah fished her phone out of her pocket and pulled up the Airline app, then handed over her driver's license. Beatrice didn't even look at the ID. She stared at the phone screen, tapped it once, and then gave a cold, practiced smile. "Yes, just as I suspected," Beatrice announced loudly. "There has been a systemic error. These seats are double-booked, and due to a strict weight and balance issue in this section of the aircraft, I am going to have to ask you to relocate." Sarah stared at her, baffled. "A weight and balance issue? On a Boeing 777? I'm an engineer, ma'am. Moving a 130-pound woman and a 40-pound child is not going to affect the aerodynamics of a commercial wide-body jet." "I do not need a lesson in aviation from you," Beatrice snapped, dropping the polite facade entirely. "The system has flagged your tickets. You purchased economy basic fares, and a computer glitch placed you in first class. You need to gather your belongings and move to the back of the plane immediately." "That is a lie," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. She swiped on her phone, opening her email and bringing up the official receipt from the airline. She shoved the screen toward Beatrice. Look at the receipt. I paid $8,400 for these 2 seats. I used my corporate Amex. It says confirmed first class right there. There is no glitch. These are our seats." Beatrice didn't even glance at the receipt. Digital receipts can be easily fabricated. "My manifest says you do not belong here." Now, Mrs. Gable next to you is a Diamond Medallion member, and she has expressed concern about the disturbance you and your child are causing. Disturbance? We haven't even taken off. Sarah looked around in disbelief. A few passengers diverted their eyes, pretending to read their magazines. Others watched with uncomfortable, silent fascination. No one spoke up. "Your child is visibly ill and coughing loudly," Beatrice said cruelly, gesturing toward Leo, who was now shrinking back into his seat, his eyes wide with fear. "This is a premium cabin. We expect a certain standard of decorum. My son has a chronic lung condition. It's not contagious," Sarah argued, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The sheer, blatant racism and classism of the situation was suffocating. "He needs to lay flat during the flight. That is why I paid for these seats. I am not moving." Beatrice's face hardened into a mask of pure malice. She leaned down, bringing her face inches from Sarah's. "Listen to me very carefully," Beatrice hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You are currently interfering with the duties of a flight crew. That is a federal offense. If you do not stand up, take your bags, and walk to the back of this aircraft right now, I will call airport security. I will have them board this plane. I will have you physically dragged out of that seat in handcuffs, and I will ensure Child Protective Services takes custody of your son while you sit in a holding cell at O'Hare. Is that what you want?" Sarah froze. The threat hung in the air like a physical blow. She looked at Beatrice, searching for any bluff, but saw only a ruthless willingness to ruin her life. She looked over at Evelyn Gable, who was smirking triumphantly while stroking her dog, and then she looked at Leo. Leo was shaking. He was terrified, clutching the armrest, his breathing already becoming shallow and rapid from the stress. If armed security boarded the plane, the trauma would absolutely send him into a severe medical crisis. And, if they were kicked off the flight, they would miss the appointment with Dr. Hastings in London. Her entire 5-year plan, Leo's chance at a healthy life, would be destroyed in an instant. Beatrice had cornered her, trapping her with the one thing she couldn't gamble with, her son's safety. "Fine," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with suppressed rage and unshed tears. "We'll move. A wise decision," Beatrice said smugly, stepping back into the aisle. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt. She reached up to grab her large tote bag from the overhead bin. "Leave the bag," Beatrice commanded sharply. "Economy overhead bins are completely full. There is no room for oversized bags back there. I am gate-checking it." "No," Sarah panicked, clutching the handle. "My son's nebulizer is in here. His emergency medication. You can take out a small pill bottle, but the bag goes in the cargo hold," Beatrice interrupted forcefully, pulling the bag down from the bin. "Fay regulations state the aisles must remain clear. You cannot have a bag this size at your feet in economy. Take your pills or the bag stays. It's a machine. A breathing machine. It doesn't fit in a pocket," Sarah pleaded, desperate now. "Please, just let me keep the bag." "I am not going to argue with you," Beatrice said, her voice booming again. "I am checking this bag. Move to the back. Row 42. Go." Defeated, humiliated, and terrified for her son, Sarah grabbed Leo's hand. She hoisted her small purse over her shoulder and stepped into the aisle. The walk from row 2 to row 42 was the longest walk of Sarah Jenkins' life. They passed through the rest of the first-class cabin, where wealthy passengers stared at them with a mix of pity and annoyance. They walked through the curtain into business class, then premium economy, and finally into the cramped, claustrophobic aisles of main cabin economy. With every step, the seats got narrower, the air grew staler, and the noise of the auxiliary power units grew louder. Sarah kept her chin high, refusing to let the tears fall, but her heart was breaking with every step. She felt the heavy, collective gaze of 100 strangers watching the Black Mother and her sick child being marched to the very back of the plane like criminals. When they finally reached row 42, the absolute last row of the aircraft, reality set in. The seats were wedged right up against the rear lavatories. They didn't recline. The smell of harsh chemical cleaner and stale urine hung thick in the air. Sarah sat Leo down in the window seat. He looked incredibly small in the cramped space, his knees practically touching the seat in front of him. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with tears. "Mummy," he wheezed, his chest visibly heaving with the effort to pull in air. "I don't like it back here. It's hard to breathe." Sarah pulled him into her arms, burying her face in his hair, the first tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "I know, my brave boy. I know I've got you." But as she listened to the rattling in his chest, she knew with terrifying certainty she didn't have him. The medication that could save his life was currently being thrown into the dark, freezing cargo hold of the aircraft. The cabin doors were sealed shut with a heavy mechanical thud that echoed through the fuselage. The engines of the massive Boeing 777 roared to life, sending violent vibrations directly through the floorboards of row 42. In the very back of the plane, the engine noise was deafening, a relentless, grinding drone that made normal conversation impossible. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its long taxi down the rain-slicked runway of O'Hare, the temperature in the rear cabin began to plummet. The climate control back here was notoriously uneven, and icy air blasted from the overhead vents. Sarah frantically twisted the plastic nozzle above them, trying to shut off the freezing airflow, but it was jammed. She wrapped her own jacket around Leo, who was now shivering uncontrollably. The stress, the cold, and the recycled, dry cabin air were creating a perfect storm in the little boy's fragile lungs. 10 minutes into the taxi, Leo's gentle, rattling cough morphed into something much worse. It became a harsh, barking gasp. He clutched his chest, his knuckles turning white, his mouth open as he desperately tried to drag oxygen into his restricting airways. The distinctive, high-pitched whistle of a severe asthma attack cut through the engine noise. Leo, look at me," Sarah said, panic seizing her throat. She rubbed his chest aggressively, trying to generate warmth. "Take a deep breath. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Just like Dr. Hastings showed us." Leo shook his head violently. His lips were beginning to take on a faint, terrifying shade of blue. He couldn't speak. He could only emit a desperate, squeaking wheeze. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. He needs the nebulizer. Now. She looked up at the ceiling and slammed her hand against the flight attendant call button. A soft ding chimed, and a small orange light illuminated above them. Seconds ticked by. They felt like hours. Leo's wheezing grew louder, drawing the alarmed attention of the passengers sitting in row 41. A young college student in the aisle seat turned around, his eyes wide. "Is he okay? Do you need a doctor?" "He's having a severe asthma attack," Sarah choked out, her hands trembling as she continued to rub Leo's back. "I need the flight attendant." She pressed the call button again, and again. Ding, ding, ding. Finally, the curtain separating the rear galley from the cabin was pushed aside. A young junior flight attendant named Chloe hurried down the aisle. She looked no older than 22, her face flushed with the stress of the delayed flight, but her eyes were kind. "Ma'am, we are currently taxiing. You need to keep your seatbelt fastened." Chloe began, but stopped dead when she saw Leo. "My son is having a respiratory crisis," Sarah shouted over the engine noise. "His nebulizer and his albuterol rescue vials are in my large black tote bag. The senior attendant, Beatrice, she gate-checked it just before they closed the doors. I need that bag right now." Chloe's eyes widened in alarm. "Oh my God. Okay, let me call the flight deck. We might have to return to the gate. I can't access the cargo hold from inside the cabin." "Please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face as Leo slumped against her shoulder, his eyes rolling back slightly. "He is suffocating." Chloe spun around and bolted toward the rear galley to grab the internal interphone. But before she could unhook the receiver, a commanding figure stepped out from the aft bathroom corridor. It was Beatrice. "What is the meaning of this running in the aisle, Chloe?" "We are in a sterile cockpit phase during taxi," Beatrice barked, her eyes narrowing. "Beatrice, the boy in 42A is having a severe medical emergency," Chloe said breathlessly, pointing toward Sarah. "His mother says his emergency medication is in a black tote bag you gate-checked. I need to call the captain to abort the taxi and return to the gate so we can get it." Beatrice looked down the aisle at Sarah, then at the gasping child. Her expression didn't soften. It hardened into a mask of pure bureaucratic obstinance. "Absolutely not," Beatrice commanded, her voice cold and unyielding. "We are already 2 hours delayed. If we return to the gate now, we will lose our takeoff slot, and this flight will be cancelled due to crew timeout regulations. There are 300 passengers on this plane who need to get to London." Chloe stared at her superior in horror. "Beatrice, look at him. He's turning cyanotic. We have a medical emergency. It is a panic attack, Chloe. Children throw tantrums," Beatrice dismissed, waving her hand dismissively. "The mother is hysterical because she didn't get her way in first class. I am not delaying this international flight because she failed to properly pack her child's medication in a personal item." Sarah couldn't stay in her seat anymore. Ignoring the glowing "fasten seatbelt" sign, she unbuckled herself and lunged into the aisle, closing the distance to the galley in 3 strides. "You did this!" Sarah screamed, pointing a trembling finger an inch from Beatrice's face. "You forced us out of our seats. You physically took the bag from my hands. If my son dies on this plane, I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life in federal prison. Turn this plane around." Passengers in the back rows were now standing up, craning their necks to see the commotion. Murmurs of outrage and confusion rippled through the economy cabin. "Sit down immediately, or I will restrain you," Beatrice yelled back, her composure finally cracking into furious anger. She reached for the heavy plastic zip ties clipped to her belt. "You are threatening a crew member. I am the senior purser on this flight, and I make the calls. We are taking off. He is dying," Sarah wailed, a sound of such profound, agonizing maternal desperation that it made the surrounding passengers flinch. Chloe stood frozen for a split second, caught between the terrifying authority of her boss and the dying child a few feet away. She looked at Beatrice's furious face, then at Sarah's tear-streaked one. Screw the hierarchy, Chloe thought. While Beatrice was focused on shouting at Sarah, Chloe turned her back, grabbed the heavy red phone off the galley wall, and punched the emergency override code directly to the cockpit. The line clicked. A deep, steady voice answered. "Flight deck. Captain Harrison speaking." Chloe cupped her hand over the mouthpiece, her voice trembling but resolute. "Captain Harrison, this is Chloe in the aft galley. We have a life-threatening medical emergency in row 42. A child cannot breathe. And Captain." She paused, glancing over her shoulder at Beatrice, who had just realized what Chloe was doing and was lunging for the phone. "We have a severe crew conflict. You need to stop the plane and come back here." Right now, the massive engines of the Boeing 777 suddenly pitched down. The aircraft lurched as heavy brakes were applied, throwing Beatrice off balance. The plane came to a complete, shuddering halt in the middle of the taxiway. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, the heavy reinforced door of the cockpit at the very front of the plane swung open. The reinforced cockpit door did not just open. It was thrust aside with the forceful urgency of a man who commanded absolute authority. Out stepped Captain Richard Harrison, a veteran of the United States Air Force with over 25 years of commercial aviation experience. Harrison was a towering figure. His uniform was immaculate, the 4 gold stripes on his epaulets gleaming beneath the harsh cabin lights. But it was his expression that instantly drained the air from the front galley. His jaw was set like granite, and his pale blue eyes scanned the length of the Boeing 777 with the terrifying intensity of a predator assessing a threat. "Who called the flight deck with a medical emergency during an active taxi?" Harrison's voice boomed. It wasn't a yell, but a deep, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly over the mechanical hum of the idling engines. Before anyone could answer, he began his march down the aisle. The entire aircraft fell into a deathly silence. 300 passengers held their collective breath, craning their necks over their seats to watch the captain. In the aviation world, a captain leaving the cockpit while the aircraft is on a taxiway is an incredibly rare, deeply alarming event. It signaled that the normal chain of command had completely broken down. As Harrison moved swiftly through first class past the business section and into the cramped main cabin, the tension grew thick enough to cut with a knife. He finally reached the aft galley, parting the curtain to find a scene of utter chaos. Sarah was on the floor in the narrow aisle of row 42, cradling Leo. The 7-year-old boy was no longer wheezing. He was gasping, a horrific, shallow, rattling sound. His skin had taken on a terrifying ashen pallor, and his lips were undeniably tinged with blue. Chloe, the young flight attendant, was on her knees next to them, holding a small oxygen tank with a mask over Leo's face, her hands trembling violently. Standing over them, hands on her hips, radiating indignant fury, was Beatrice. "Captain Harrison." Beatrice immediately began, her voice shrill as she attempted to seize control of the narrative. She stepped into the aisle, physically blocking Harrison from the child. "I apologize for the disruption." This junior attendant panicked. "We have a non-compliant, hysterical passenger who is fabricating a medical crisis because she was upset about a seating reassignment. I was just about to have her restrained." "Step aside, Beatrice," Harrison commanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Captain, if we turn back now, we violate the timeout protocol." "I said, step aside," Harrison repeated, and the sheer glacial force of his tone made Beatrice flinch. She stepped back, her back hitting the lavatory door. Harrison dropped to his knees, his tailored uniform trousers hitting the sticky floor of the economy cabin. He ignored the dirt. He reached out and placed 2 fingers against Leo's carotid artery. His brow furrowed. The boy's pulse was erratic, racing at a terrifying speed as his heart desperately tried to compensate for the lack of oxygen. "The onboard oxygen isn't working." Sarah sobbed, her hands hovering over her son's chest, terrified to touch him, terrified to let go. "His airways are closing. He needs his albuterol nebulizer. It's an electronic compressor. It opens his lungs." "Where is it?" Harrison asked, his eyes never leaving the boy's blue-tinged lips. "She took it," Sarah shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Beatrice. She forced us out of first class, and she physically tore my bag from my hands at the gate. She checked it into the cargo hold. Harrison's head snapped up. He looked at Chloe, who gave a frantic, confirming nod. "It's true, Captain. Beatrice gate-checked a piece of critical medical equipment against FAA regulations. I tried to tell her we needed to stop." Harrison stood up slowly. He turned to face Beatrice. The senior flight attendant suddenly looked very small under the crushing weight of the captain's stare. "You gate-checked a passenger's life-saving medical device?" Harrison asked, his voice eerily calm, the kind of calm that precedes a catastrophic explosion. It was an oversized tote. It violated the aisle clearance parameters for the economy cabin. Beatrice stammered, her arrogant facade beginning to crack under the severe scrutiny. She said she had medication in it, but passengers exaggerate all the time to avoid paying baggage fees. I was following standard operating procedure for a full flight. "Standard operating procedure," Harrison repeated softly. He took a step toward her. "Does standard operating procedure include ignoring a cyanotic child? Does it include threatening a mother with federal arrest when she begs for her son's life? Because from where I am standing, Beatrice, you have not only violated federal law, you have actively endangered the life of a minor on my aircraft." Beatrice's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. Harrison didn't waste another second on her. He pulled his heavy radio from his belt, clicking the transmit button to speak directly to the ground control tower and his first officer in the cockpit. "Tower, this is Heavy 4082. We are declaring a code red medical emergency on board. I am aborting the taxi. I need an immediate clearance back to gate B12. Have a team of paramedics and airport police waiting at the jet bridge, and get the ramp manager on the line. I need the forward cargo hold opened the millisecond we cut the engines." Static crackled over the radio, followed by the urgent voice of the air traffic controller. "Copy that, 4082. You are cleared for immediate return. All traffic is being diverted. Emergency crews are scrambling to B12 now." Harrison looked down at Sarah. His expression softened, a brief flash of paternal empathy breaking through his rigid professionalism. "Hold on to him, Mum. We are going back. We're going to get his medicine." As the massive aircraft began to rumble, reversing its course on the tarmac, the passengers in the back rows erupted. The tension broke, and the collective outrage that had been simmering was unleashed. A young college student sitting in row 41, Tyler Mitchell, stood up and pointed at Beatrice. "You're a monster. We all saw you. You treated them like garbage." "Yeah," shouted an older woman from across the aisle. "You dragged that poor boy back here like he was a criminal. You should be locked up." Beatrice pressed herself against the galley wall, her face draining of color as the passengers turned on her. For the first time in her 30-year career, her uniform and her title offered her no protection. She was exposed. The agonizing crawl back to gate B12 felt like an eternity. Every jolt of the aircraft's wheels against the tarmac sent a spike of terror through Sarah's heart. Leo's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The onboard emergency oxygen tank was barely keeping him conscious. His small hands clawed weakly at his collar, his eyes rolling back into his head. "Stay with me, Leo. Look at Mommy. Keep your eyes open," Sarah pleaded, her voice hoarse from crying. She pressed her forehead against his, her tears dropping onto his cold cheeks. 2 minutes, Captain Harrison said firmly, keeping his hand on Sarah's shoulder to ground her. Just 2 minutes. When the plane finally lurched to a halt at the gate, the seatbelt sign vanished with a ding, but nobody moved. Captain Harrison had specifically ordered the passengers to remain seated over the PA system to keep the aisles clear. The heavy forward door of the aircraft was ripped open from the outside. 3 paramedics, led by a burly EMT named John Sullivan, flooded onto the plane, carrying heavy trauma bags and a portable defibrillator. They practically sprinted down the long aisle, guided by Chloe's frantic waving from the back. "Talk to me," Sullivan demanded, as he dropped to his knees beside Leo, instantly shining a penlight into the boy's unresponsive eyes. "Severe asthmatic crisis, triggered by stress and cold," Sarah rattled off, her engineering mind latching onto the facts to keep herself from completely breaking down. "He has chronic pulmonary fragility. Oxygen saturation is crashing. He needs his albuterol ipratropium nebulizer treatment immediately. It's in the cargo hold." "We're on it," Sullivan said, slapping a pulse oximeter onto Leo's tiny finger. The machine beeped frantically, displaying a terrifyingly low blood oxygen level of 81%. "I'm pushing intramuscular epinephrine right now to force the airways open, but we need that machine to sustain it." Outside the window, through the driving rain, Sarah could see the neon vests of the baggage handlers swarming the underside of the Boeing 777. The cargo door slid open, and men began violently throwing suitcases onto the tarmac, desperately searching for Sarah's black tote bag. Inside the cabin, Sullivan injected the epinephrine into Leo's thigh. The boy jerked, a harsh, jagged breath tearing through his throat, but his airways were still too inflamed to function properly. "Come on! Come on!" Harrison muttered, looking out the window. Suddenly, a massive cheer erupted from the ground crew outside. A ramp worker held up a soaked, heavy, black canvas tote bag like a trophy. He sprinted up the external metal stairs attached to the jet bridge. Seconds later, a breathless gate agent rushed down the aisle and handed the bag to Sarah. Sarah ripped the zipper open with trembling hands. She bypassed the binders of medical records and pulled out the compact battery-operated nebulizer machine. She expertly clicked the plastic tubing into place, snapped the vial of liquid medication into the chamber, and placed the mask over Leo's nose and mouth. She flipped the switch. The machine hummed to life, producing a thick, white, life-saving vapor. The entire rear cabin watched in stunned silence as the vapor filled the mask. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. And then Leo took a deep, shuddering breath. The medication hit his inflamed lungs, rapidly relaxing the constricted muscles. He took another breath. Deeper this time. The horrific wheezing began to subside. The terrifying blue tint around his lips slowly began to fade, replaced by a flush of healthy pink. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and exhausted, and locked onto Sarah. "Mummy," he breathed into the mask, his voice weak but clear. Sarah collapsed forward, burying her face in the boy's chest, sobbing so violently her entire body shook. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. You're okay. You're going to be okay." Sullivan checked the monitor. O2 sats are climbing. 88, 92, 95, he's stabilizing. "Good job, Mom. You did exactly what you needed to do." A collective sigh of relief washed through the aircraft. Tyler Mitchell, the college student, actually started clapping. Soon, the entire economy cabin was applauding, the sound echoing off the curved walls of the fuselage. But as the medical crisis de-escalated, a new, far darker confrontation was brewing at the front of the plane. 4 heavily armed officers from the Chicago Police Department's Airport Division boarded the aircraft, led by Sergeant Liam Caldwell. Their heavy boots thudded against the carpet as they marched toward the rear. "Captain Harrison," Sergeant Caldwell said, nodding to the pilot. We got a call about a passenger disturbance and a medical emergency. What's the situation? Before Harrison could speak, Beatrice pushed herself off the galley wall. Her uniform was slightly rumpled, her hair out of place, but her venom was entirely intact. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Sarah. "Officers, thank God you are here," Beatrice declared, playing the role of the victim with Oscar-worthy conviction. "That woman assaulted me. She verbally threatened my life, caused a panic among the passengers, and intentionally disrupted a federal flight. I want her removed from my aircraft in handcuffs immediately, and I want her child handed over to child services." The sheer audacity of the lie silenced the cabin once again. Sarah, still holding her recovering son, looked up at Beatrice with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Sergeant Caldwell frowned, looking from the weeping mother and the sick child to the immaculate, sneering flight attendant. He pulled out his notepad. "Is this true, ma'am?" Captain Harrison stepped squarely between the police officers and Beatrice. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his company-issued iPad, tapping the screen with heavy, deliberate strikes. "No, Sergeant, it is not true," Harrison said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "The only person leaving this aircraft in handcuffs today is Beatrice Miller." Beatrice's jaw dropped. "Captain, you cannot be serious. I am your senior purser." "You are my senior purser," Harrison corrected her coldly. He turned the iPad around to face Sergeant Caldwell and the surrounding passengers. "While the paramedics were working on the boy, I took a moment to log into the airline's central ticketing mainframe." Beatrice claimed that Mrs. Jenkins and her son were moved to the back of the plane due to a systemic glitch that double-booked their first-class seats. She claimed they held economy tickets. Harrison swiped to the next screen. "As the captain, I have override access to the raw data logs of every ticket scanned at the gate. Mrs. Jenkins paid $8,400 for 2 confirmed non-refundable first-class tickets. There was no glitch." Sarah listened, her anger simmering back to the surface. She had known she was right, but hearing it confirmed by the captain made the injustice sting even more sharply. "So why were they moved?" Sergeant Caldwell asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "That is exactly what I wanted to know," Harrison said, his eyes locking onto Beatrice with a furious intensity. "So I checked the manual override logs. 5 minutes before boarding commenced, a gate agent's terminal was accessed to manually void Mrs. Jenkins' first-class seat assignments and reassign them to row 42. It wasn't a computer error. It was a human action." He tapped the screen one final time. "The employee ID used to execute that manual override belongs to Beatrice Miller." A gasp rippled through the passengers, who could hear the exchange. Chloe covered her mouth with her hands in shock. Beatrice went completely pale. That is impossible. My login must have been compromised." "The system. Save it," Harrison snapped. "The system tracks exactly which terminal was used. It was the podium you were standing at. You purposely downgraded a mother and her severely ill child to the worst seats on the plane. And you did it knowing the child was sick, because you actively targeted their medical equipment to punish them for protesting." Sergeant Caldwell narrowed his eyes. "Why would she do that? What's the motive?" "That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle," Harrison said, his gaze shifting toward the front of the aircraft. "When Mrs. Jenkins was moved, her seats 2A and 2B were suddenly listed as occupied by a standby passenger, a Mr. Gregory Walsh." Harrison looked back at Beatrice. "Who is Gregory Walsh, Beatrice?" Beatrice looked at the floor, refusing to answer. Her silence was a confession. "I'll tell you who he is," Harrison said, his voice dripping with disgust. I checked his frequent flyer profile. He is listed as Evelyn Gable's brother. Mrs. Gable is the diamond medallion passenger sitting in seat 2E. The pieces violently snapped into place. Sarah let out a gasp of pure shock as the horrific truth dawned on her. Harrison turned to Sergeant Caldwell. "Here is what happened, Sergeant. Evelyn Gable boarded the aircraft early with her designer dog. She saw a black mother and her sick child sitting across the aisle from her. She didn't want them there, and she had a brother who was flying standby, hoping to get a seat on this sold-out flight. So Mrs. Gable approached Beatrice Miller. We will check the security cameras in the terminal later, but I am willing to bet my pension that a significant amount of cash exchanged hands." Beatrice manually deleted Mrs. Jenkins' tickets, forced her to the back of the plane under the threat of federal arrest, confiscated the medical equipment to ensure compliance, and gave the $8,400 seats to Evelyn Gable's brother. The silence in the cabin was so absolute you could hear a pin drop. The sheer, calculated evil of the act, trading a child's life for a bribe and racist appeasement, was almost impossible to comprehend. Sergeant Caldwell closed his notepad. His expression had shifted from professional inquiry to cold, hard law enforcement. He looked at Beatrice, who was now trembling, her arrogant posture completely shattered. "Beatrice Miller," Sergeant Caldwell said, stepping forward and reaching for the heavy steel handcuffs on his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You can't do this," Beatrice shrieked, backing away until she hit the bathroom door. "I have worked for this airline for 30 years. I know the CEO. I have seniority. Right now, you have the right to remain silent," Caldwell interrupted, grabbing her wrist and twisting it firmly behind her back. The sharp click-click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed through the cabin. "You are under arrest for reckless endangerment of a minor, extortion, and interfering with a flight crew, and we'll be adding federal civil rights violations to that list before the night is over." As Beatrice was aggressively marched down the aisle, the passengers didn't just clap, they cheered. Tyler Mitchell stood up and yelled, "Have fun in federal prison," as she was dragged past him. Beatrice kept her head down, her meticulously sprayed hair falling into her face, completely humiliated and destroyed by her own malice. Sergeant Caldwell sent 2 of his officers to the front of the plane. A few minutes later, Evelyn Gable, clutching her Pomeranian, and her brother Gregory were escorted off the aircraft in handcuffs as well, destined for the same holding cells as Beatrice. With the perpetrators removed, the heavy, toxic atmosphere that had plagued Flight 482 finally lifted, but the reality of the situation remained. Sarah and Leo were sitting in the cramped, freezing back row, completely traumatized by the ordeal. Captain Harrison knelt down next to Sarah again. His face was gentle, completely devoid of the terrifying anger he had shown Beatrice. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said softly, "I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what happened to you and your son on my aircraft. That woman's actions do not represent this crew, and they do not represent me. The paramedics have cleared Leo to fly, provided he stays on his nebulizer schedule. If you are still willing to fly with us tonight, your seats in first class are waiting for you, and I promise you, you will be treated like royalty for the rest of this journey." Sarah looked at Leo. The boy was leaning against her, breathing easily now, the medicine having worked its magic. He looked up at Captain Harrison and offered a small, tired smile. "We need to get to London," Sarah said, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable strength. "Dr. Hastings is waiting for us." "Then let's get you to London," Harrison smiled. Harrison personally carried Sarah's heavy tote bag. Chloe, the young flight attendant who had risked her job to save Leo, gently took Leo's hand. Together, they walked the length of the plane. This time it wasn't a walk of shame. It was a walk of triumph. As they passed the economy and business class sections, passengers stood up and applauded. People offered Sarah warm smiles and words of encouragement. When they returned to seats 2A and 2B, the pods had been entirely cleaned and prepared. Chloe brought Leo a massive blanket, 3 different kinds of dessert from the galley, and a pair of plastic pilot wings directly from Captain Harrison. For the next 8 hours, as the massive Boeing 777 soared across the Atlantic Ocean, Sarah and Leo slept deeply in their lay-flat beds, safe and undisturbed. The story of Flight 4082 did not end when they touched down at London Heathrow. True to Sarah's plan, they made it to Great Ormond Street Hospital. Dr. William Hastings performed the groundbreaking pulmonary procedure on Leo. It was a resounding success. Within 3 months, Leo's lung capacity had doubled. Within a year, he was playing soccer on a community team in Chicago, running across the grass without a single cough, breathing the fresh air deeply and freely. Back in the United States, the fallout from the flight was catastrophic for those involved. The airline, facing a massive public relations nightmare when the story leaked to the press, fired Beatrice Miller immediately and stripped her of her pension. She was subsequently convicted of felony reckless endangerment and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Evelyn Gable and her brother were banned from the airline for life and faced hefty federal fines for bribery and conspiracy. The airline CEO personally flew to Chicago to issue a public apology to Sarah Jenkins. As a gesture of goodwill, the airline completely refunded the $8,400 ticket cost, covered all of Leo's medical expenses in London, and provided Sarah with lifetime first-class flight privileges. Chloe Davis, the junior flight attendant, who had possessed the courage to break protocol and call the captain, was commended for her heroism. She was promoted, and her bravery became a core case study in the airline's new training program on crew intervention and passenger advocacy. Sarah Jenkins had boarded that plane as an exhausted, terrified mother fighting the world for her son's right to breathe. She walked off of it as a testament to the unstoppable, fiercely protective power of a mother's love, a force far more powerful than any corporate policy, and far stronger than the hatred of those who tried to push her to the back. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power that made your blood boil? Captain Harrison and Chloe proved that true leadership means standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. If this story of a mother's fierce love and ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends to spread the message that discrimination has no place in our skies. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true-to-life stories of everyday heroes fighting back. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were on that plane? Let us know.